Good morning, everyone. Can I summon the roundtable into being as people apparate into their frames? Welcome all, welcome panelists, welcome attendees to this opening roundtable for GIFCon 2022, the research about research across media. I am Matthew Sexter. I teach at the University of Glasgow, including on a course called Fantasy Across Media, but I am only here in my role as chair for this. So we will be hearing from a series of really exciting fantasy researchers. I will introduce them now briefly using their blurbs, and then we will go straight into a series of questions about their research. We are also very keen to have questions from the chat if people would like. We have in the webinar, which we are in now, we have a special Q&A function, which you can see in the toolbar at the bottom. So if you have a question, if you can add it to the Q&A, that will make it a lot easier for us to pick it up a bit later in the roundtable. If you are on YouTube listening to this, then I think someone will be keeping an eye on the YouTube chat and we'll be able to transfer questions across if needed. So I will just do introductions and then we will get going. So the first person I will introduce is Arvaniti, who is a Greek PhD student studying at the University of Glasgow, investigating the representations of theatre in contemporary fairy fantasy literature. She holds a BA in Theatre Studies from the National Kapodistrian University of Athens and an MLit in Fantasy Literature from Glasgow. She is a member of the University of Glasgow Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic and the Administrative Assistant for the Once and Future Fantasies Conference we have coming up this summer. She's currently working as an archivist with Company of Wolves, not a terrifying Angela Carter-inspired story, but a Glasgow-based laboratory theatre company. She directs fantasy plays for the amateur theatre group Puck's Players. I'm just going to kill my email to prevent beeps during this call. Our second roundtable participant is Paraneeta Shetty, who has worked with young people and children's books in India in various ways. She completed her MLit in Children's Literature and Literacies from the University of Glasgow in 2017. Her blurb says she's currently a final year doctoral researcher in the School of Education at the University of Leeds. I believe that Parinita actually submitted yesterday, so feel free to fill the chat with balloons and celebrations. She launched a PhD podcast called Marginally Vanished to research intersectionality and public pedagogy in fan podcasts. And she and her co-participant explored some of their favorite science fiction and fantasy media to co-create intersectional knowledge about different marginalized and privileged experiences. She shouldn't currently be writing right now, I think general, but is probably watching Avatar: The Last Airbender. I'm not right now, although that would be quite a thing, quite a feat of parallel processing. Our third participant is Katarina Odette, who is a film and television studies PhD candidate at the University of Nottingham, whose research centres on fantasy television, genre studies, and media industry studies. She received a BFA in screenwriting from the University of Southern California and an MLit in fantasy from the University of Glasgow. She serves as general editor of Mapping the Impossible with the Glasgow Journal for Fantasy Research, and her own research can be found in Fantastica Journal, Slayage, A Shadow Within, Evil in Fantasy and Science Fiction, published by Luna Press, and Extrapolation. And our final roundtable participant is Emma French, a SAGSA-funded PhD student at the University of Glasgow, researching how Dungeons & Dragons consolidates our notions of fantasy while enabling players to subvert established genre conventions. Her work addresses D&D's treatment of race, gender, and sexual orientation, and looks at how players are using the game to address and repair the problematic legacies present within fantasy genre culture. She graduated from Oriel College, Oxford in 2015, and from the University of Glasgow with an MLit in fantasy in 2019. So we have a fabulous series of people to ask questions about the joys and challenges of researching fantasy across media. We will do that right now. So I have pre-circulated a series of questions to the panelists to get us going. The first question I asked them was about their sort of experiences of moving across different media themselves in their experiences of fantasy. So the first question I would like to ask our panelists is, what forms of fantasy media have you been engaging with longest? And are there media forms that are newer to you that become very important to how you frame what fantasy can do? If anyone would like to volunteer to go first with that, otherwise I will nominate someone. Rita, go ahead.
This is where you have one extrovert on a round table. So I'm obviously interested in theatre. A shock, I know. And as equally, I think a lot of people on this round table are aware, I've recently been getting into puppets and puppetry. It's actually becoming a problem and affecting my everyday life. But it was really interesting coming into sort of fantasy academia from performance studies and theater background, because that was my undergrad. I have never studied literature and cannot read. So how I approach the fantastic has definitely been shaped by a background in theater and theories of theater, and sort of trying to marry the two has been something that I'm attempting to work the kinks out of in my research since moving to Glasgow, 5 years ago and doing the MLit. It's really interesting because I think I might be slightly biased, but I think sort of looking at the fantastic and even fantasy literature through a theatrical and performative lens opens up a lot of areas of exploration and sort of allows us to reframe and recontextualize a lot of preformed ideas that we have about how the fantastic operates. I know there is a question in the future that will allow me to dunk on Tolkien, so I'm not going to get into that. I'm just going to stop talking.
Thanks, Parinita. If everyone else is being self-declared introverts, Emma, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. I thought it would be good to follow on from Parinita, because I think I have the opposite journey, which is that the form of fantasy that I was most acquainted with was books and fantasy literature from a very young age. And then through kind of literary circles, I started attending fan conventions and getting more involved in the kind of fan studies side of fantasy, which I think is a kind of huge part of the fantasy genre that sometimes gets put off in a separate space when, as proved by these conventions, they interact together constantly. And yeah, the newest and most important form of fantasy for me is Dungeons and Dragons, which I actually only got into very recently, relatively like 5 years ago or something. But I think it's a medium that was perfect for me for having that kind of literary aspect and then the fandom and fan studies aspect all conjoined in one medium, where you have fans and you have readers all playing with the genre and using their multiple influences to formulate stories. So that was, for me, that was an interesting and perfect microcosm to explore everything that I've become interested in over time. That's my answer.
That's brilliant. Parinita,
I can go after that, just because what Emma said about fandom is what I'm personally interested in my research as well. So the first fantasy media I engaged with was also books, and like generations of readers in India. It was Enid Blyton books. I don't know if people still read her at all, but generations of readers have grown up in India reading her, and the Magic Faraway Tree series is the first sort of my memory of fantasy. And then as a young teenager, I sort of started growing up in like online fan fiction and fandom communities. So a lot of that has influenced my engagement with fantasy. And in my research now, more recently, during my PhD, it's been fan podcasts, where it is engagement actually. They're doing a lot of analysis, a lot of literary analysis, but outside this academic structure. So I'm really interested in how these fan podcasts act as this space of public education, especially for, media, like globally popular media, where fans from different backgrounds, both marginalized and privileged, come together and co-create knowledge and co-create intersectional literacy by using fantasy or science fiction or any popular media. But I guess fantasy and science fiction does tend to have more fanish people. So just how they create this knowledge about intersectional literacy in not a formal educational space. And actually Marita was one of my co-participants as well. So it's nice to be in the same space again. Sorry, my cat is being very noisy. I shall stop now.
Noisy cats are definitely encouraged. Sorry, Kat, go ahead.
So I, a bit out of left field, I guess for me, the first fantasy media that I recall engaging with was Baroque opera because that's just what my parents did. So I like was literally kind of born engaging with that. And obviously there's a whole debate about ahistorical definitions. And a lot of those operas focused on myth. So there's a lot of messiness with definitions there, but I was sort of born into fantasy. I did not get a choice about what genre I was going to spend the rest of my life focusing on. And then television has kind of been a through line. I would love to say that I've developed new interests recently, but I just have always really loved television. And my route, kind of like Parinita, my route was really in from a kind of practitioner industry perspective. My undergraduate degree was in screenwriting, and I worked in the industry in the least cool way possible before quickly realizing it was not for me. But so when I came into the fantasy lit and started looking at fantasy studies, I was very much coming from the perspective of someone who was thinking about how the industry makes fantasy television and what impact that the cultural industries have on shaping the texts that come out of this particular medium, at least in the country that I tend to research, which is the United States. I apologize for that.
Thank you very much. And I think that's a really useful sort of, there's already some really interesting commonalities coming sort of out of the discussion about people coming in from not just from a list of books or a kind of text, but from communities of practice of various kinds, and the importance of those for how we think about fantasy. It is not just a list of things, but it's a whole group of practices and people and environments and ideas clustered around in complex ways. So I think one of the reasons why fantasy crosses media very effectively. Let's now though turn to the specific media forms that your doctoral projects are focusing on. The blurb for the Roundtable says that the Roundtable is going to assess the experiences, challenge and joys researching fantasy and media beyond literature. So what are the challenges and joys of the particular form of fantasy you're researching?
Well, it's not very hip, Matt. It's not very down with the kids. Theater, bless its heart. No, I'm joking. The main thing in my continuous gripe is that a lot of the time when I try to explain that I'm interested in fantasy theater, the answer that I get is, but isn't all theater really fantasy if you think about it? Which is, it is just deeply unhelpful, isn't it, as a frame of mind? If we think about it philosophically, everything everywhere is fantasy, so there we go. But yeah, it's sort of, because theater has had, because theater is the oldest form of media that we are discussing today, the first, the trendsetter, it is very difficult to sort of, it has gone through many phases and it has changed a lot. So it's very difficult to isolate, you know, this is the kind of theater I'm talking about, this is why I'm talking about this is how this tracks to other forms of theater. And, you know, in a world with, you know, as many various and varied theatrical traditions as there is people, it's quite difficult to make sure that when I say theater and when you hear theater, we are talking about the same thing, which was an interesting and unexpected problem that I had in my first year of PhD, when I found out that I said theater from my Greek background, and one of my supervisors was hearing performance studies, whereas I was saying theater to mean drama. So it's sort of, it's trying to needle in the haystack your own research and your own corner of this like very long tradition. But yeah, that I will say is definitely the biggest and most interesting, I think, difficulty in my research, because, you know, people tend to forget theater exists, but that's not very exciting as a lens to rant against. But yeah, that's basically it.
Does anyone else want to pick up that question? Rita, there is a question in the chat for you if you want to pick up on that, the difference between performance studies and your own approach. But let's hear from people, and then we'll come back and pick up those questions and any comments that come out of the sort of connections that we draw. Parinita, go ahead.
Yeah, so in terms of the challenges, I think one of the biggest challenge, there's the cat butt for everybody. I think one of the biggest challenges is just how time consuming recording a podcast is. I believe very much in podcasting as sort of engagement with fandom and fantasy and research and just making knowledge more accessible. But recording the podcast is the least time consuming aspect of the whole thing, the post-production, pre-production, everything. And then on the other side, where I was also listening to existing fan podcasts as sources of literature and scholarship, I think this may be like something that maybe my fellow panelists have also dealt with, that when you're also a fan or like you like what you're reading or what you're doing the research, it's really difficult to sort of, know when to stop. Like when I listen to podcasts, I'm listening to them. Sorry, he's attacking Miss Marvel. Miss Marvel has a new villain. So I used to listen to podcasts all the time, like while going to walks or while going on walks, while folding laundry, doing like really boring chores and things. And I'm like, oh yeah, this is actually my break, but it wasn't, because my brain wasn't being turned off. And it just got, and this was 2020 as well when I was recording the podcast, listening to, so it just became this all-consuming thing. So I think the sort of balance between being a person and being a researcher and being a fan was, I think that's one of the dangers of researching something you love.
For me, there's like two challenges, and then one becomes kind of the joy. The first challenge that I think a lot of people, again, across this entire conference will sympathize with is the tendency of like, we've established fantasy literature as a genre in its own right that deserves serious study, but often that happens at the expense of other types of fantasy. And D&D is absolutely like one of those, because people kind of see it as like boilerplate or simple or derivative. So there's like a lot of like, this is the serious part and this is the cringe part, and D&D is always in the cringe part. And that kind of leads to the challenge of there's not many sources that will adequately address D&D, or at least its relationship to literature in like the time that literature has becoming a genre, from like the 1970s period where it becomes a market category. So that was also became a joy in the end, because it meant I could just pick and choose from lots of different areas. So I took stuff from fan studies, and I took stuff from literary studies and game studies as well, and tried to form something in the middle. But there was definitely a challenge of like, even the sources that do discuss D&D are over 10 years old. So actual play hasn't happened to those scholars. So there was a challenge of just finding material that directly and accurately reflects what I'm trying to study right now. That was kind of a mixture of prejudice and just the fact that everything is developing so quickly in the current moment that scholarship is struggling to like accurately reflect what's happening.
Yeah, I think probably like an experience that a lot of us have doing research in a medium and genre overlap that hasn't necessarily been done before, is that you have the experience of like, you want to find sources for it and you don't have those. So you're like the classic 20s experience of looking around for the adult in the room, and then you realize that you're the adult in the room, and that can be terrifying and also like very, very thrilling. I think for me specifically, because I approach fantasy television primarily from a media industry's perspective, rather than, I don't really do textual analysis on series, at least at the moment. So I look for genre in how different kind of institutions and stakeholders within the industry are talking about genre. And it's just, that's an absolute nightmare. I have a chapter looking at how television writers talk about genre, and spoiler alert, everyone talks about it differently. And so you end up having this like extremely messy nightmare to try to sift through. But I think that is also one of my supervisors, Catherine Johnson, always says that like the methodological challenges you face in your research are oftentimes the thing that is actually what becomes the most interesting. Like you poke the bruise, and where it hurts is where you find the interesting conclusions. That metaphor didn't track. It's fine. It's 10 in the morning. I'm fine. And so that for me, that messiness has been both this thing that you try to navigate and you try to figure out how to work with it, but it is also what makes it so rich, because you get to see genre as it exists in the world being this incredibly messy, inconvenient thing to research.
It probably seems like quite a good time to pick up Zoe's question in the Q&A. So that seems, so I'm going to take us off our pre-circulated questions briefly. Do add questions to the Q&A and we'll try and address them and weave them in if you have things you would like to ask our expert panel. But Zoe's asked, have you found that being affiliated to either media-specific degrees, centres or departments, so the literature department, the film department, the education department, in your case, Parinita, or fantasy studies institutions, has impacted your research? So how has the framing that exists at the institutions where you're doing your doctorates either facilitated or got in the way of framing these queries where you're effectively inventing or opening up new fields in the work that you're doing?
I mean, I definitely know for me doing a television studies degree that I often feel like, one, it's again that experience of being like, oh no, am I the expert in the room who knows about the fantasy side of things? But it's also that like my supervisors are not necessarily as invested in fantasy. And I think sometimes that can be really productive, because in trying to defend the interests of your project, you're forced to kind of make arguments and do the work that you should be doing as an academic. But also sometimes it feels a bit like, can you just embrace my two weird loves that don't really sit together well, and there's no one I can sit with who also loves these two things in the same way. So yeah, there can definitely be some like tension but joy from it.
I have just a thing to add on here that is mostly it's a cell phone. It's not that useful, but I was doing my paper for GIFCon, as you do, and not only it's about theater and fantasy, it's about Greek theater and fantasy. So I very quickly yesterday got to a point where I made like a statement, and I was like, okay, someone needs to fact check this for me. I can't just be saying random things in this paper, even though a lot of people listening in will probably not be familiar with the source material. And I had sort of look at the usual people that I send my research on to beta for me and sort of offer a second read. And no one would be familiar with the text I was discussing. So I called my mom back in Greece, and I was sort of automatically translating my paper over the phone and being like, Mom, I know you're not an academic, but you've directed this play that I'm talking about. This is the argument I'm making. Does that make sense? And my mom, from a taxi, I think somewhere that she just happened to pick up the phone, was just like, okay. What do you mean by paratext? Okay. I think that makes sense. So, that's, yeah, can I get an academic vibe check, Mom? And obviously, she is my mom. So I'm still not sure that I passed the vibe check, but if you listen to my paper later and you think that I did, you think that I didn't, well, my mom says you're wrong. So there you go.
So in my case, because I'm like in a social sciences education department studying fandom and fan podcasts and intersectionality, nobody knows what I'm doing. My supervisors come from two very different backgrounds. One is more children's literature and sort of, I guess, reader response. Another is like working with young youth literature and youth culture and things in Cuba, of all places. But I've actually found it really helpful, like what Katarina was saying as well. It's a bit alarming when you're the person who knows more about certain things than your supervisors do. But I think like being able to articulate because having to explain it to somebody who doesn't know really does make you a better thinker and a better writer, I think. And also just having these really different perspectives inform your own thinking. I really appreciated that. And then to, sort of get my my kind of community conferences like this, like they're great to just geek out with people. Or even, so one of my supervisors asked me to do a guest lecture based on my research for children's literature. And just talking about fandom within things like fantasy, like here, or within children's literature and, sort of education in my school. I think bridging those different gaps in different spaces is really helpful in just sort of expanding the conversation.
Yeah, I was a bit wary about adding my answer because I feel like I've got the easy job of this, which is that one of my supervisors is Matt, who is very aware of Dungeons and Dragons. So I'll just write my chapter about Critical Role and he'll start adding comments about different episodes and examples I haven't thought of. So there is a definite benefit of like having a fantasy community at Glasgow where we can pitch fantasy across media in a completely selfless and not at all self-motivated way, and have these conferences where we get to discuss the things that might not be discussed at other institutions with the same kind of consensus knowledge at the ground level. So yeah, I would say that I have the kind of opposite thing, which is that I guess my second supervisor might, who is from TV and film, but does have knowledge of live streaming and actual, not actual plays, but Let's Plays, he might be nodding along in the background while me and Matt have Critical Role chats, but ultimately I am kind of supported in my research by having someone who knows what I'm talking about. So that's nice.
I'm very glad I managed to fool you into thinking that I know even half as much as you do. But I think we've had a question in the chat about sort of pushing back against that sort of idea of fantasy as being escapist. I think we can come to that question in a moment, but should we come to that through a sort of more positive route first, and sort of can you do the pitch for the particular kind of fantasy or fantasy culture that you're studying? So what do you think the form that you're studying is particularly good at doing in terms of presenting fantasies or addressing audiences or facilitating interactions? What would you describe as the real strength or what's the heart of your thesis in terms of what you want to say to advocate for the form that you're studying?
I think, well, my first point that I wanted to bring up is kind of answering that question that was in the chat, which is that I think it shows that even the playful and the frivolous or like the escapist can be incredibly serious, like both for the people who are playing a game like Dungeons and Dragons, they might just be there to have a good time, but a lot of the people that I encounter in these circles are like there to be authors or to like explore a question with a character. And then we see this with actual play as well, the amount of investment that audiences have in the kind of dynamics around a table or the stories being told, like even the playful and things that are being done for just pleasure or fun end up becoming serious and incredibly immersive. The more like theoretical argument that I have for Dungeons and Dragons, which I guess was kind of in my bio notes, so I guess I always put it front and center, is that I find it really interesting that it's basically a place where you see genre convention being like put down in rules. So people will say like orcs are evil, or goblins will always try to steal, or like those are like written in text where those are the rules, those are the alignments and laws of this universe and this fantasy genre culture that is like around that universe. And then there's also that little caveat of, but you can change anything you want and you can do anything differently if you disagree with something in those rules. So you see a lot of what the genre is assumed to be at the top level of the rule books, and then you see what people are individually doing with it, particularly around things like race or gender and sexuality. And they're like, no, I don't agree with this. I want to do something original and new, and I want to switch up these rules and make something different in my own little universe. So there's that really interesting tension between like pre-established convention and originality, which like I think applies to the whole genre, but it's just happening in this one little place in a really interesting and obvious way.
I think as soon as I turned off mute, the dog started moving around. So sorry about that, everyone. So I think with theatre, it's a very interesting question, because I can't do an unbiased answer of this question. I'm sorry. I think theatre is one of the most immediate and intimate forms of creator to audience connection that we can have. The audience is right there. You're interacting with the performers, even in a it doesn't have to be panto, it's behind you, etc., etc., etc. Being present in the same space together means that you are, in a way, co-creators, which is also what happens, when you're reading a book, and when you're playing D&D, and when you're watching TV as well. But it's just a more, I think it's as explicit as playing D&D with your DM is. It's sort of very much an interaction. You don't consume theatre, you sort of interact with theatre, and it is capable of creating magic and creating a sense of wonder in a way that is, I think, wholly unique to it. So my God, Benny's snoring behind me. I don't know if you guys can hear him. I'm sorry about that. But my example is a very old one, and it's from Peter Pan. But when Peter Pan was first performed, you had the scene where sort of Tinkerbell drinks the poison and flickers out and dies, and then the audience has to clap in order to bring her back. So that is obviously a very explicit and very specific form of audience to performer interaction. And when they were first staging Peter Pan, there was a worry at between the cast and crew that the audience was not going to respond to it, especially since the first performance was mainly adults and theatre critics and stuff like that. So they thought it would just go completely unanswered. So the orchestra had a cue to start clapping if the audience seemed unresponsive, to sort of start this whole process. And that didn't end up needing to happen, because as soon as Peter said, clap your hands if you believed, everyone, crotchety theatre critics, old people, adults, grown serious Victorian men, just jumped to their feet and started clapping. And the actress playing Peter Pan was saying, she was standing on the stage looking down, and she was like, I was convinced that everyone in the theatre at that moment truly believed in fairies. And that is, that is a big example of the kind of effect that theatre can have on creating that sense of wonder and inspiring and, realizing the fantastic. But yeah, I love that story.
I can go. We were just playing chicken. So I am really interested in how conversations can act as a tool of collective knowledge making. And in fan podcasts, I think they really sort of challenge ideas of who can make knowledge and what knowledge looks like, and where knowledge can be sort of published or accessed or how. And, in terms of like the fan podcast that I was looking at, it wasn't like there were a lot of critical looks at popular fantasy and popular media. But this critique was born out of love. It was born out of this really deep emotional investment in their favorite media, and they wanted it to be better. So it wasn't just, anti-fans who were like just sort of wanting to hate something that is popular. It was people who, from backgrounds that they didn't see represented in the media, so they were, through their commentary and their conversations and their perspectives, they were inserting their own identities into the worlds, and I guess diversifying canon in a way that mainstream media canon isn't really doing in a lot of spaces. And I also think that fan podcasts, it can be adapted to so many different contexts as well, depending on who is the one who's participating in the conversation, or what media they're looking at, or what sort of analytical lenses they're applying. So be it race or gender identity or sexuality, class, whatever. It can be adapted to so many different places around the world, just using fantasy as this shared language. So that's just the beginning of the conversation, and what fans and what people do with that as a framework. I think that's really interesting.
I guess for me with television, this is maybe not necessarily unique to television, it's maybe more serialized media in general, but I love that these long form stories that get built out of all these small pieces, I love the way that impacts the world building, that you get like one-off episodes, and sometimes it's a one-off and it just kind of enriches your understanding of the world, and other times it's almost like you can see the whole production team go, oh, that's what our show is about, and you watch the whole thing spin into being about that thing. I think that's one of the things I love about television, is how meta is not the right word. Again, it's 10 and my brain is not properly on, so I don't know what word I'm looking for here, but it's the way that you can kind of see television being made. You can see it responding to production challenges that even people who don't necessarily track all that stuff, yes, reflexive, there we go, Matt with words, that you can yeah, again, even if you're not somebody who really tracks a lot of behind the scenes stuff, there'll be things where an actor comes on screen and you know that they're like too famous to be on the show, and you immediately know, oh, that character is going to have a bigger role. Like, I love how all of that stuff comes in when you're watching television, and people can really kind of see it being built live, and you watch the show figure out what it is, like that whole process, and the way it feels as a viewer to watch it, if it gets several seasons, to watch that kind of unfurl. That's just the kind of live creation of television is something that I really love. And for fantasy, I think the world building aspect makes it particularly just exciting.
Thank you for those. I mean, I think we might come back to the rest of Jess's question, but I think I wanted to start with that because I think that really is the best way to answer the age-old dismissal, fantasy is simple escapism or childish, is to talk about how complex it is and what it does for its audiences, what it does for its readers, pull out those complexities, but do that in the kind of passionate advocacy that you've all done for the areas that you're discussing. But I'd want to move on for that question before giving you a chance to answer it from a different angle. So would any of you like to sort of deal with or engage with this sort of problem that people sometimes have when about sort of assumptions about fantasies? So about fantasy, that it is simple or straightforward, or perhaps something that it is a bit strange to study compared to really old books, for example.
As a roundtable, I see we're not about the negativity of it at all. We're all just like, we like to talk about what we like. No, I think, so I think that the apologia sort of fantasy has been something that obviously we've had to deal from the outside coming in, but I don't think that it is unique to studying fantasy. I think, especially with PhD researchers of our generation, there are a lot of things that, and a lot of topics that are being explored outside of the fantastic and outside of SF in general, that are getting this sort of raised eyebrow, but is this really worth your time to study kind of response. And I think that with fantasy, I'm just going to just take this with a caveat. Like, I don't mean it as a negative thing, and I absolutely put myself in that as well. I think as a culture, SF and fantasy is quite comfortable in assuming an underdog position and sort of going in, taking for granted that we're going to be underestimated and stuff like that. Like, it is a narrative that is easy to fall into, especially, you know, growing up from nerd spaces and things like that. It just sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You are expecting to see this, so when you see this, you're justified, and you miss out all of the times where people have taken you seriously, and people have given you the space and the tools and the support to research what you want, and spend your entire day going through fantasy chronologies and figuring out if people liked theater back in the olden times of 1850, which is something that I did and is absolutely useless and will not be involved in my PhD in any way. But we are getting I think we sort of need to be careful moving forward about falling back into the comfortable narrative of being undervalued in academia, especially because, we're not that much if you think about it, and if you compare it to people doing other kinds of work, and it does, fear is the mind killer. It goes into your head, and it starts influencing how you see your own work. And I've had a lot of struggles with my PhD, not so much with thinking about it and writing it, although that's another question for another day, but mainly with convincing myself that what I was studying was worth studying about, and that I had something to say. And that is an internal thing that comes from within, but sort of accepting it as an external force as well just makes it easier for you to fall back into that self-doubt. And it's just, I don't think it's very useful as a perspective.
One of the things in like the chapter that I've been working on at the moment is about television writers talking about what they think of the genre that they're writing. And it has been interesting seeing like how very kind of like ashamed of it all these writers are. You have writers who've made their careers writing SFF, particularly fantasy, who will then say like, oh, I don't hire people who send me spec scripts that are SFF. They like have internalized that external narrative of the idea that they should be ashamed of the genre they're writing, to the extent that they then pass that on to other writers as they're hiring. And it's been interesting looking at all these interviews, because the interviews I'm looking at span the past 10, 15 years, but some of that rhetoric is not changing. And it's really kind of sad to watch. That it feels like a lot of these people are really very stuck in the idea of how fantasy television was talked about 15 years ago. And I'm like, Eric Kripke, calm down, stop being ashamed of the thing you're writing. This is what your career is built on. You're going to have to accept it at some point. But the joy of getting to analyze their discourses is that I get to make all those points, but by using their own words against them. So that is very fun. Kill your heroes by analyzing their discourses.
I also think that in my case, it's just the kind of sort of spaces I've curated, and like, because I come from a fan studies kind of place as well, where there used to be, like, I think in the first wave in the 1990s, and there used to be this sort of defense of the, like this underdogness, as Marita was saying. But now people have largely moved beyond that. And in fan podcasts as well, nobody is trying to defend that, because they're fans, right? They love the thing. They've created this podcast to talk about the things they love. So nobody is trying to really defend why it's important, or like, if you don't think it's important, don't listen to this podcast, seems to be their attitude. It would be a self-selecting audience that does engage with these spaces and communities. So I think that's influenced me in a way, in that when I talk to people, like especially in my social sciences and education thing, in the first year, I think I was a little more cautious, because I was like, oh, these people are studying things like, I don't know, things that are so different from what I'm doing. But then talking to people about what I was doing and why I think it's important, really like seeing their reactions to it. It's never been like, oh, what you're doing is silly, or what you're doing is frivolous, or anything like that. So I think that sort of, because of the spaces and communities and ideas that I was engaging with, helped me articulate it to people in a way that they took it seriously as well. So obviously, like Marita was saying, I have huge issues with my own internally, like in terms of whether it's worth spending time on this, whether it's important, all these things. But I do think what fan podcasts and what these people are doing is important. And then sort of translating that to people who've never heard of these things and then seeing their reaction. Like my supervisors have said they've learned so much through my writing about these different areas and different people. So that's been really helpful in making me take a step back and not really thinking of things like fantasy or fandom or whatever as, I mean, it can be frivolous, but frivolous doesn't need to mean that what they're doing isn't valuable or creating this really important kind of knowledge.
That was kind of my hesitation initially over answering the question, because part of me doesn't want to leave the escapism and the childishness, because I'm talking about a game, so it's kind of self-defeating to be like, I've never played this for fun, I don't switch off my brain on a Saturday afternoon and live out a power fantasy for a few hours with friends. That's also what D&D is. It's really interesting to me that people can get very invested in this game and use it to create original ideas, and that's becoming a space that people want to use as their storytelling mechanic. But there are also a lot of people who are never original, and that's fine. And then there's people who make joke characters and they turn into something original. So there's an interplay of playfulness and escapism and childishness that becomes serious, and sometimes it doesn't. And that was kind of why I wanted to study D&D in relationship to fantasy literature, because I was struggling with this history of the genre that just didn't acknowledge all of the other types of media that was going into the literature being produced. So the way that people do play and playfully engage with imaginative worlds, and then that makes them want to write something original, or they do both and they do inform each other subconsciously. So yeah, I like to keep the fun aspect, because that's why it's a game, that's why I play it. So it's quite hard to separate those in my mind, even as I'm arguing in some of the arguments I'm making are using that rhetoric of, well, actually this is serious, but I think the investment can be serious and playful, and it doesn't have to be both as well. Yeah, so it's a bit of a difficult one for me, to be honest.
I feel like we're tacking towards the question that Alice has put in the Q&A, so maybe we should pick that one up at this point. So I'll read this out. When Parinita was talking about the challenges of researching something you love and knowing when to stop, and Emma talked about academia accepting fantasy lit as the serious genre, I'm thinking that maybe the academy just can't handle joy in any way. Harsh, but not entirely unfair, perhaps. We definitely have better languages for talking about why something is political or cleverly constructed than we do about how it brings pleasure or creates feelings. So this is Alice's question for all the panelists. How do you incorporate love, joy, happy, fanish feelings into your own critical frameworks? Does studying things you love ever ruin them for you?
My answer is pretty anecdotal, to be honest, but for me, I do play a lot of D&D, and I also I've started doing things like DMing and writing my own stories and engaging in it in a kind of, I'm not bringing any of that into my academic research necessarily, because I'm not sure my project is exactly like that, but I have formulated a lot of my opinions on what I think the game is theoretically doing through playing it and playing different flavors of it. So playing horror games, playing those power fantasy escapist games. I found that a lot of what I think Dungeons and Dragons is doing has been formulated by actually just playing a session and analyzing my own feelings about that session afterwards, and that can be in the position of DM or player. So yeah, I kind of just, I guess, incorporate my joy by having this way of practically exploring what I'm thinking on a insanely regular basis, because I do play a lot of D&D. So yeah, that's my answer to that question. I just make sure that I'm tying in the things I find fun and also testing out ideas in a fun space and not just keeping it grounded in theory.
So I think just going, oh, sorry, Marita, go ahead. Sorry. So just picking off on what Emma said, for me, what I found is that critical analysis and fun and emotion are not separate things. Like the more and more that I've been researching, and also like through my own podcast as well, it's that all of these are like, they can coexist together. So you can be having fun while you're talking about how misogynist a lot of, like science fiction, like popular science fiction and fantasy media is. Or like at one point, me and a couple of my co-hosts did sort of how would we decolonize the Hogwarts curriculum, and like went off on like really strange tangents as well. So it's just, there's this really fantastic podcast that I love called Witch Please, which is this intersectional sort of feminist podcast. And there the co-hosts, they've said that they very purposefully don't edit out the laughter because they're friends. So, they laugh a lot throughout their episodes, even while they're critically analyzing sort of gender or race or whatever in Harry Potter. And they keep the laughter in their episodes because they think that a lot of criticism and academia as well doesn't make room for joy and laughter, especially like anybody who has any sort of marginalized identity. They're, the way that they engage with the things they love, they're supposed to write in a way that, I guess, resembles what's always been done for so long. So they're trying to challenge that. So I think that these things don't need to be like, I very much incorporate joy and fun and silliness even when I'm being serious and angry and whatever. So I think, yeah, it's even within the thesis itself as well. I think that there's room for both.
Tentatively. Sorry about that. We are very moody today. There is that, I was supposed to be looking for that, but obviously I was a bit distracted. But there is that quote from Ursula Le Guin that I'm going to paraphrase horribly. I think it's from Language of the Night, but I'm not entirely on top of that, which says that as a culture, we tend to put a lot of weight and assume that things that are sad or angry or unjoyful are the things that bear depth, and that we read joy as being frivolous and as being shallow. And that's not exactly the quote, but that is, I think, the gist of it. And I think there's definitely, an issue in academia about that as well. You even when you're researching something like, comedy, you're researching it through a serious lens and through you're trying to bring it down, you're trying to change it from what it is into something else. And you see how many works on comedy we have that just, I see this in Pratchett studies all the time, where we are trying to approach Terry Pratchett's works as uniquely being, or not uniquely, as solely being something that has the potential to be serious, and not something that is frivolous. There's a country called Jelly Baby, but yeah, sorry, I am completely scattered-brained at the moment. That really threw me.
Yeah, I think for me, it's less that, it's never ruined, researching a thing that I love has never ruined the thing. It's more that when you're trying to set boundaries around your research, it makes it basically impossible for me to, take time away. Like I had a point where after I'd written a chapter, my supervisor was like, we want you to take a break from fantasy for a week. Just take some time and space away from it. And I was sitting there being like, what do I do with my time? And realized that was everything that I do is tied into fantasy. And also the chapter I'd just written was about Netflix and their categorization system on their interface. So I literally couldn't even open Netflix because that wouldn't be a break. Because as soon as I saw an alt genre in one of those rows, I was like, researcher brain on. And so I think that is, that's the real kind of insidious thing that can come up when you're researching something you love, is like, it's how you put boundaries around it and be like, I am not a researcher right now. I am just opening Netflix to look for some trash to watch. I am not here to be academic.
I am not a researcher right now. I am just a killjoy about other people having fun.
Perhaps a good way to close would be to sort of bundle the final sort of questions that I sort of circulated for you to think about, which were about sort of exciting works of fantasy that you've encountered recently, or media you think that have a really strong potential for fantasy that's untapped, or kinds of fantasy media you think deserve academic attention. Tell us about some cool things we might not know about and why we should pay attention to them. That would be really great. People would be happy to do that.
So a show that I was thinking of when you asked this question is Undone, which is on Amazon Prime. It's basically about this woman who gets in a car accident and then starts to have a weird relationship with time. And the thing that's really interesting about it is that it's rotoscoped. So they filmed the actors and then they kind of animate them. So the whole thing has this uncanny valley thing, especially if you recognize any of the actors, because you're like, no, that's Daveed Diggs. I know, but he's animated, but it's him and it's his face. And so it's already a bit kind of uncanny valley. And then when the fantasy stuff kind of starts happening, there isn't this clear distinction between the stuff that is not fantastic and the stuff that is fantastic because of that animation style. And it's very hard to describe if you haven't seen it, but it just really kind of blends those things in a way that you don't really get with live action television, where there's a more clear, like, here's a shot with no effects, here's a shot with effects. And so Undone, second season drops on Friday. I'm not being paid by Amazon. Obviously, I'm not being paid by Amazon. No one's being paid by Amazon.
The problem with the stuff that I'm researching is that because of the give me 1 second. Because of the ephemeral nature of the theatrical performances and how difficult they are to circulate outside of their usual context, it's really difficult to rack theater stuff that I watched and I enjoyed. We had the touring production of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe adaptation come up to Glasgow, and it was fascinating. Just from from an adaptational perspective, from a theatrical perspective, this is what fantasy theater looks like after Harry Potter and the Cursed Child came into the world and sort of bulldozed the aesthetics of the medium. But yeah, it's obviously not. If you are ever in a position where you can watch The Strange Undoing of Prudentia Hart, I would greatly recommend it. It's very Scottish, and it's about academics at an academic conference talking about Tam Lin. So people who know me will know that is absolutely on my sort of on brand. But other than that, I've just been listening to a lot of podcasts, reading a lot of books. As I said, because of our fantasy and puppetry event, which plug is on YouTube, you should go see it. It was actually great fun. I'm at the moment just able to read dense books about puppets. So this is toward the aesthetics of the puppet, puppetry as a theatrical art. But yeah, I'm not very fun to wreck things at the moment, but there's a lot of cool theater around. Please look up your local theaters and go watch something weird.
So one of my problems was that because I was working on the thesis and before that recording the podcast, I was only listening to fan podcasts. So it was mostly non-fiction. But then when Matt sent us his questions, I was just researching what kind of fiction podcasts exist. And now that I have my life back again, I really want to explore that, because there are a lot of really cool things being done with fantasy and speculative fiction in general. and also like I think they bridge sort of Emma and Marita's things a little bit. So like D&D, this Adventure Zone is a really popular podcast. I think it's called the Adventure Zone, but where they're essentially playing D&D, this family. And they also like, there are these really well-crafted narratives, just audio, but they are like plays because they'll have like multiple people, sound effects, using just the medium of audio to craft these really immersing stories. So that's where that's the rabbit hole I'm gonna go down, and I'm sure like the audience has recommendations as well. But I think fiction and podcast is really good. Yeah.
You do recommend some non-fiction podcasts if you would like, Parinita. Don't let my poor phrasing of the question stop you talking about the things you want to talk about.
Oh, so there's so many. That's a terrible question. But in terms of just fan podcasts in general, which please is fantastic. Woke Doctor Who, which Katarina actually recommended to me and became a big part of my thesis, is also really good. That's like Doctor Who, I guess not fantasy, sorry, but it's still a really good podcast. And I shall think of more because brain is mushy and I'm gonna like put it in the chat. But yes, Emma, you can go next.
Yeah, so I also had like a struggle with this question because I've been trying to get back into books, somewhat counterintuitively to the theme of this conference. But then I kind of realized that the Critical Role TV show just came out on Amazon. Again, we're not getting sponsored by them, but I think it's it's really fun. It's really well done, actually, to be honest. But I also think that from a academic mindset point of view, it was really interesting. I think the fact that there's a D&D show in the mainstream is again like overturning all those underdog narratives of the fact that I'm afraid we are like pretty popular and well known now. Like we're not in that niche sphere all the time. And it's also just a really interesting show because they remove the D&D from the narrative because they kind of have to for copyright reasons. So it's interesting to see what they keep from the original live streamed campaign and what they preserve and what they have to get rid of. And like the fact that they preserve a lot of the kind of character-based, almost sort of transformative fan fiction elements and like seeing the way that they script the characters and their development from what happened improvisationally into like a scripted character arc was really interesting. I don't know what it would be like to people who had never interacted with Critical Role. I know that my friend really enjoyed it and she hadn't seen it, but in general, it's just a really interesting adaptation because it's the first of its kind, and that's why I would recommend it. So, yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for all of those recommendations. We also have Night Vale and Arcane in the chat for anyone who is watching this on recording and does not have access to the chat. I think we will be kicked out of this webinar very soon, and for good reason, because at 25 past, there are 3 different excellent panels you might go and see. But if you have further recommendations, please do take them across to the Discord. Please do take further discussion across the Discord. Please do get in touch with any of the Roundtable speakers if you have further questions for them. And can I just ask you all to thank our wonderful Roundtable participants for a really exciting and joyful discussion of fantasy research across media. So thanks, Parinita, thanks, Rita, thanks, Emma, and thanks, Kat, for all of your wonderful contributions. I think at this point, I would just ask whether anyone else on the Roundtable has any last words or anything that they would like to add. Okay, in that case, we will let you all go and brew some exciting teas or other beverages if you choose, but it still feels like definitely tea time to me before we reconvene for our series of panels in about 20 minutes. So thanks all for coming along and see you all in the panel sessions in a little bit.